Time machine. Experiencing momentous events often compels us to consider the very nature of time and eternity. In 1961, when I was 7 years old, my father took us all, the whole family, on a vacation from our home in Canada to camp in southeastern United States. However, as my dad was a published researcher for the American Civil War, his primary mission this trip was to go to a small town in Georgia to have a prearranged meeting with well-known, outspoken, 108-year-old Caucasian woman who was a charter member of the Daughters of the Confederacy. Apparently, this lady was one of the last survivors of the vicious Civil War, which ignited over a century before we traveled to see her that summer. My serious-minded father explained that the war between the states began when the South seceded from the northern states in 1861. This elderly woman was just 8 years old then. That meant that this survivor would have been about 12 years old when the terrible conflict ended in 1865. Then my father gave up his 3 sons, who ranged in age from 4 to 11, the strictest of instructions to be entirely respectful to this woman and to always remain completely silent during this consultation. As part of his historical research, my father intended to record this last survivor of the Civil War with his trusty reel-to-reel recorder. Remember that in 1961, we were all living in a technologically deficient age prior to the invention of low-profile cassette or digital recorders. So armed with that bulky tape recorder, a large black microphone, and a yellow pad loaded with questions, we arrived at the scheduled address in that very small town in Georgia, right on schedule. My dad parked our shining new red Volkswagen Beetle on the street right across from a small, old, and dingy white bungalow that had gutters crawling with vines that crept down on all sides from the moldy roof. Surrounding the entire property was a dirty white picket fence with missing pieces of those wooden slats, so that the enclosure kind of reminded me of a mouth full of yellowed and missing broken teeth. A ragged barrier protected the weed garden that was masquerading as a lawn. Prominent was the overgrown wild mixture of unidentifiable plants that lined both sides of the very narrow stone walkway that led up to that wraparound porch. There was a shabby white trellis attached to the balcony. The railing was thickly interlaced with vines, and this shabby and neglected house just looked as if nature itself was in the process of reclaiming it from its human host. Closely following behind my father, we cautiously climbed up those squeaky, creaky wooden steps. They seemed to be rotting up to the veranda, but that veranda had surprisingly newer wood deck. On the left side of this terrace, there was an old-fashioned double-seated rocker chair swing with blue and white cushions and a cloth top. And on the right, there were 4 newly painted white wicker chairs with matching checkered blue and white cushions. And there was a small, round, white wicker table between them. My mom and us sons all stood at attention behind my father, who gently knocked at the well-used door. And then he knocked a little louder, and finally, one more time with authority. The door seemed to screech and then slowly opened to reveal the single oldest person that I had ever seen. This ancient woman was shrunken and twisted by time, bent over by age, and yet her smiling face still seemed bright with wisdom and personality. When she finally spoke in her charming southern drawl, she welcomed us into her home. exhibiting such a Southern grace. I immediately liked her. And somehow, now the quaintness, strangeness, the whole home made sense to me. This dear woman invited us all to sit on the veranda. So my older brother and I silently plunked down on that swing and immediately began to rock back and forth, while my parents and my youngest brother took the wicker chairs. Immediately, the lady asked my parents if they wanted to join her in sharing a mint julep she had previously made. Not waiting for their answer, she immediately spun on her heel, retreated into her home, returning swiftly with 3 light-colored green frosted drinks. My parents merely tasted that classic Southern bourbon beverage and immediately stopped drinking it. It was after their surprising first sip that they both realized that they were drinking alcohol. You see, they had never drank a drop of alcohol in their entire lives, having taken the Prohibition Pledge in 1941 when they were both teenagers, 20 years previously. Undeterred, though, the woman once again disappeared back into her home, and then we heard banging and clanging and shuffling, only for her to emerge with 3 homemade lemonades from the lemon trees that were growing in her own backyard. And she proudly served us 3 boys. I still remember how sweet and delicious that refreshing beverage was, which she topped off, by the way, with shaved ice. Best of all, she generously and continuously refilled our glasses with the large pitcher of lemonade that she placed on that little round table as she talked, whenever our cups were empty. Meanwhile, my father got busy setting up his reel-to-reel tape recorder, placing the microphone on that table in front of the woman. And he even had to run an extension cord through her front door to the electrical outlet that was inside of her home. Now, I do not remember all the process of the interview, nor any of the questions that my dad asked her, but what I do remember with the clearest recollection of this feisty, animated woman sitting on the edge of her chair, lucidly telling us the story of the South before, during, and after the war. She initially started the conversation by describing her golden memories of a gracious but lost era when the South had dignity, power, and culture, when the plantation families created legacies and the rich lived in extravagant mansions, where the hoop skirts were long, but the gowns were cut low, when ladies were untouchable and gentlemen defended them, their honor. Dance was the waltz and cotton ruled, when bourbon flowed and Dixieland flourished. A time so long ago. In her fond memories, Georgia was her Camelot, her Avalon, Utopia, and Shangri-La, all rolled up into some sweet Southern dream. This woman spoke lovingly about her family and about the beautiful life that she once enjoyed, and then how it all abruptly died. Her reporting and recounting of a life before the war was so magical, and yet there was a deep undercurrent of such sadness. I felt like she was like a human time machine, and I had been invited to take a trip back to the best places in history with her. But the tone of her discourse suddenly changed when this survivor began recounting the specifics of how her beloved father and her 3 oldest teenage brothers all went to war against the North to protect their home, family, and Southern way of life from those damn Yankees who wanted to destroy them. The woman spoke with increasing volume and authority and emotion and conviction, talking about her many haunting memories, now with tears falling, and in a shuddering voice, she stated that she could never, ever forget that dreadful day when her mother received the terrible news that her son was shot and killed in a deadly skirmish with the Northern armies. Then she recalled that merely weeks later, the black and white, endless day, when two Confederate officers came to her house to inform her mother that her beloved husband, the father of her children, and the only man that she had ever loved, also tragically lost his life in this bloody conflict. These horrific memories evoked a torrent of tears, and the dear woman lost her composure at remembering the loss of both her father and her brother. Bravely, the woman pressed on and somehow seemed to swallow her wounds and put a forced smile on her wrinkled face. And then she got up to pour us boys a refill of that tasty lemonade from her pitcher. Sitting down, she continued where she left off by describing how her youngest brother finally came home a year later, but the field surgeon had to remove one of his legs to prevent the spread of gangrene. The woman described in detail how much pain her brother continually endured, walking with crutches on his remaining leg, while the ever-present dressings on his stump seemed always to be oozing blood and odorous pus. The next year for the family was filled with calamities, food shortages, and everyday struggle for survival, with never enough. They always felt like they were in danger, as life was so fragile and death so common. One day it happened. They started to hear the distant sound and flash of cannons in the distance, then ragged rifle fire coming closer, the sulphurous smell of gunfire, and finally the suffocating smoke in the air, with every breath becoming a challenge, as General Sherman from the Union side deliberately set fire to farms, homes, crops, trees, and all of Atlanta, where they were living in their dilapidated family estate. This blazing inferno instilled terror into the South, as General Sherman, in his total war, torched every trace of civilization for 300 miles from Atlanta to Savannah. This diabolical and destructive 37-day march to the sea broke the very heart of the Confederates, driving the proud South into the ground, never to rise again. After the shameless surrender at the Appomattox courthouse, the war was over, and her oldest brother finally came home in body, but never in heart. Her dear, formerly happy-go-lucky brother was now an emotional casualty, as he was moody and angry and silent, never able to laugh, and refusing to talk about the cruelties and carnage he had suffered. All the family's savings were gone. Their former great wealth evaporated. And even the Confederate money that they had carefully saved up was now completely worthless, as it was no longer legal currency. As her family was scratching just to survive, this survivor told stories of planting a garden, sewing clothes, raising chickens, selling eggs, and the survivor exclaimed that no matter what they did, it was never enough, because of all those damn tax collectors who came and finally forced their family to sell their house for the back unpaid taxes, to leave the only life that they had ever known for an uncertain future somewhere in the country with one of their cousins. Sitting silently on my perch, on that swing, on that porch, I literally observed the fire flash out of her eyes, as though tears, rage, and sorrow and hatred. She unexpectedly started shouting, damn carpetbaggers, over and over again. Unconsciously, I stopped my rocking and was staring at her with my mouth open, completely shocked by her sudden loud and coarse vocalizations. The lady turned to look at me, sitting so stunned on that swing. But then she was able to calmly describe in detail the term I had never heard before. The despised carpetbaggers were apparently unscrupulous opportunists from the North who took advantage of the broken South to unjustly profit from their brokenness. Wow. She then poured us a glass of lemonade, and it started to feel like things were calming down, even though the fire was still inside her. Now, with those explanations over, the woman suddenly returned to her tirade by repeating and yelling, only this time even louder, "Damn scallywags! Damn scallywags!" And then, once again, she seemed to turn towards me to reasonably explain in a much quieter tone that scallywags were her fellow Southerners that betrayed their families and their friends and the Confederate way of life by supporting the Yankees to plunder the South. And then she outlined how much she hated them and how much she hated the Freedom Bureau, which was set up by the Federalists to help all of those freed blacks with free housing, free food, jobs, and land, while selectively punishing all of the white folk whose only crime was that they had honorably served in the Confederate Army, just trying to protect their way of life. After this lucid explanation, she once again erupted and screamed out at the top of her lungs in a white-hot rage, "It's all so damn unfair!" And with this volcanic explosion foaming at her mouth and spitting out her words, this formerly gracious elderly woman became so animated, she began swearing and cursing as if the events that she had been describing had just occurred, rather than happening over 100 years before. The unending agony that infected her for 10 long decades exploded out of her life like lava until there was no more lemonade left in her pitcher, and the tape on my father's recorder finally ran out. The end of that tape suddenly began to whip around and around and around, making a slapping sound against the inside of the tape recorder. And that is when the woman simultaneously collapsed into herself, suddenly looking so old, fragile, and broken. A suffocating silence filled the room as the centurion was finally done talking. She evidently became so distressed that she could absolutely no longer speak. It was obvious to me, even at my young age, that the sweet lady was trapped in time, held captive by her pain and issues. I saw her become that 9-year-old girl once again, who was completely overwhelmed at the news of her father and brother's death, at the horror of war, and the torture of the tragic circumstance of her life. She was imprisoned by the many cruel memories. She was still reeling from the countless injustices that she suffered. Yes, these tumultuous events were in a century past, but to her, the blood was still flowing. The bodies were still rotting. Everyone she knew and loved was still suffering. And this evil Union Army was still marching, ever marching, to raid, rob, rape, and ruin everything in its path. That is when the woman suddenly stood up, pushed her chair back with a screech, and said in a contrived manner, "Thank you for coming, but I'm going to lay down now." With no other warning, she hastily went into her house, curtly yanked out the extension cord to the tape recorder, and tossed it onto the porch floor. Then, without turning around, slammed the door on us. We were all shocked how this gracious Southern belle was completely transformed by the pain that she had endured so many years before to become this unrecognizable, hate-filled being. The interview was obviously terminated. Thoughtfully, my father picked up his notes, recorder, microphone, and extension cord, and then silently, we all shuffled down those same groaning stairs, retracing our steps till we all piled into that cramped little VW Beetle. We drove in stunned silence on the way to the campground to finally pitch our tent in the dark. After experiencing such trauma, what can you say? Mere words just seemed to be so meaningless. Her wounds were so fresh. and her anguish so real, it was impossible for me even to remember that the trauma was so very, very long ago. That woman had literally transported us all into a journey through time to share in her excruciating ordeal, such as human beings were never designed to endure. In my childish mind, I somehow intuitively realized that she had never gotten over the compelling tragedies that she had suffered. How could she? With all that she had suffered, I felt so very sorry for her. In 1966, there was a TV show I enjoyed immensely called Time Tunnel, where two scientists, two doctors, were trapped inside of a time machine. They were lost, ever traveling through dangerous and primitive ages, never being able to return to the happy present. And I remember when I saw that program, 5 years after meeting that woman, that I was still thinking about her. It occurred to me at that time that although she had physically survived the Civil War and was free, just like her brother, she was still emotionally trapped inside her own time machine, so wounded, never able to escape from the torment of those formational memories. As the years passed, and me going through my own tragic circumstances and losses, I truly began to realize just how easy it is for all of us to become captive to the many injuries that are unescapable in life. It was during the periods of intense suffering that I realized how much I needed a Savior to deliver me from that same trap of time, bondage of bitterness, and prison of pain. You see, the only path to freedom was to freely forgive from my heart all of my captors, every single person that had ever hurt me, and then learn to trust our loving, all-powerful God who promised us to make all things right eventually. Deuteronomy 32:4 affirms that everything that God does is just and fair. He is a faithful God who does no wrong. When I gave up on myself and gave in to God, Jesus was able to finally set me free. When I let go of my need to blame and to fix and to justify by trusting that the God of all the earth will only and ever do what is right, that's when he released me from the brutal and the unbearable anguish that defined my existence. Thank you, Holy Spirit, for the gift of your peace that literally passes all of my understanding and healing my wounded heart. I just wish that that dear woman had also allowed God to comfort her soul before she died. I will never know what happened to her, as my father never spoke to her again. I do know that I will never forget being on that swing on her porch, drinking her lemonade while listening to her passionately converse about her previous life so long ago. It is strange that now, more than 6 decades later, I am finally able to tell her story. It occurs to me that in my 7 decades of living, how much I myself have become a time machine, full of passionate stories that live on inside of me. I just pray that God will allow the entire flow of my being to be his spring of fresh, life-giving water in every recollection, every action and testimony and expression. Oh Lord, never let me become a destructive, erupting volcano full of burning lava of self-pity, bitterness, and anger and regret. Instead, dear Jesus, use me as your time machine to transport needy people into your healing, loving, timeless presence. I hope you enjoyed this story. And if you'd like to hear more, go to Glimmer of Hope on Spotify or on Taken TV or on our YouTube channel, Hope Casts. I look forward to seeing you there. May God bless you.